mic for you, or? Okay, perfect.
Test. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming to the panel on methane and ag and waste. Do feel free to sit in the first two rows. I promise we don't bite. You don't have to sit in the back. My name is Eric Redding. I'm the Chief Climate Officer of Abt Associates. Abt is a consultancy that works in critical areas of public policy, including methane, using data and analytics to solve some of the world's most challenging puzzles. And this conversation today is going to be about methane generally, and very specifically agricultural and waste methane. This will be followed by a reception here in the pavilion, and then we will have another panel on energy methane to follow that. We'll also, you will notice, we are a manel today, although we decided to go with a little bit of diversity, and to break up the bald, bearded white guys, we have Jeremy, who has hair. But let me take a moment to introduce our speakers here with you today. On the far end, bald, bearded white guy number one, is Jonathan Banks. Jonathan works with the Clean Air Task Force since 1999 and serves as Global Director for Methane Pollution and Prevention Program, where he develops and directs all of CATF's international efforts to dramatically reduce methane pollution from energy, waste, and agriculture. He brings over 2 decades of experience working with governments, companies, and civil society around the world to implement policies to reduce methane pollution. He works to catalyze international coalitions, country-led policies, and subnational efforts, and to foster rapid change. He also serves on the board of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. Prior to CATF, Jonathan worked as the policy director for National Environmental Campaign, working to clean up coal-fired power plants, and as a legislative assistant for U.S. Congressman Ralph Hall. Second bald white guy number two is Jonathan Tousell, who's the Senior Director for Global Agricultural Methane at the Environmental Defense Fund. John facilitates EDF's work to focus attention on the critical climate issues of agriculture methane, to spur development of innovative solutions to cut on-farm methane emissions, and to find pathways to support farmers in adopting new technologies and practices. Bringing experience in environmental policy, agribusiness, entrepreneurship, and the commercialization of livestock health solutions to the role, John is passionate about helping farmers improve the economic and environmental sustainability of their farms and deliver global food security. He believes strongly in the power of co-created solutions to fight climate change. And finally, Jeremy Douglas is the Global Director of Partnerships at Delterra, an environmental NGO that designs and implements programs to transform waste systems in the Global South. Jeremy spent his career leading impactful and innovative partnerships and campaigns to scale impact across sectors. Jeremy's collaborated with major companies, impact investors, and heads of state to drive environmental and social change. He's also led creative partnerships that span everything from NFTs to a DJ event live streamed on Twitch. So, we're covering a lot of area today in ag and waste methane, but we're going to try to pull it all together and really focus on what are some of the new developments and what's happening in this space. Obviously, there's a lot of methane programming throughout COP, but we're trying to assume that people know a bit about methane if you were attracted to this panel, and take it from there and go a little bit deeper. You've probably seen that there's been a lot of attention and announcements to methane, and particularly actually implementing the Global Methane Pledge here at COP, including the Low Methane Initiative, Waste Map, the California Subnational Methane Action Initiative, the first ever Local Climate Action Summit, and a focus on food loss and waste, as well as the announcement of new EPA rules on oil and gas methane that are being rolled out today. So let's get started with some questions to the panel. I wanted to ask all of you, in the areas that you focus on, what are some new and promising waste and ag sectors, some new and promising developments in the waste and ag sectors around methane mitigation? What are you seeing within your sectors in terms of policies and innovations that are working and are going well and that can be replicated?
I'll start on the ag side, and again, maybe just to set the scene. So for those of you not familiar with the agriculture methane question, about 40% of our human-related methane emissions are from agriculture. The vast majority of that is from livestock, and within that livestock sector, the vast majority of the methane is from the cow burps, so what we call enteric fermentation. That's the cow's stomach. And so we think very broadly about three solutions that we look at. The first is how do we address those enteric solutions, or excuse me, how do we address those enteric emissions? The second is how do we help improve and optimize productivity? So we think about how do you reduce the amount of methane per unit of milk produced or unit of meat produced. And the third solution set looks at manure, because manure is a methane, a source of methane emissions as well. The solution sets look a little different when you talk about global south and smallholder producers compared to global north and more intensive solutions. I'll say, I think when focusing on kind of global north, where we have some capacity to look at new innovations, really exciting. And I mean, let me back up and say one of the really exciting across both of those sectors is the announcement that the Global Methane Hub made just the other day around a $200 million enteric accelerator that they're launching. And so one of the challenges is that the cow's rumen, and I'll dork out here, the cow is this amazing creature that takes plant matter and creates usable protein that for humans, but we don't understand how that system works. We don't understand that rumen. And so $200 million investment by the Global Methane Hub to launch research and into the enteric accelerator to find solutions that work. So that's a really exciting solution that's just come to light. And I'll say one of the areas they're looking at is low methane cattle. So I'll talk about moo love. If you think about cow genetics, so cows, the vast majority of cows in the US are bred using artificial insemination on dairy cows. And so we can choose the genetics from the cows that we want for the next generation of cattle. And we know that actually there is a difference in cows where some cows genetically, because of their genetic genes, produce higher methane and some cows produce lower methane. So a really interesting project coming out of Canada recently and funded by the Quebec, in part by the Quebec carbon pricing mechanism, is that they actually have gone through and built a model where we can now predict which bulls will lead to higher methane cattle and which bulls will lead to lower methane cattle, so that farmers can start to select. The great news is that because we have the systems in place, we can predict that those low methane bulls, if the farmers select them, they actually won't see a backtrack in productivity at all. So they won't lose production at all, even if they're selecting the low methane. So those are two quick highlights that we're excited about.
Great, that's very exciting. So turning to waste a little bit, Jeremy, do you want to tell us what's exciting to you?
Sure, thanks for teeing that up, because now I'll go on from agriculture over to the waste sector, which is the third highest source of methane, human-caused methane emissions, and especially in global south countries where Delterra works, we see that emissions from waste can be anywhere between 10 and 35% of a city's carbon emissions budget. So much higher than in global north countries. And a big reason of that is the proportion of organic materials in the waste stream is much higher. It's 50% or more in most countries. And in some countries like Indonesia, 70, 80% in some regions is organic waste. And right now it's all being sent to dumps, landfills, burned, or otherwise not properly separated from the waste stream. So this is a really promising opportunity because it's such a low-tech solution. It starts with getting people to separate their waste streams at the household level. So that's something that we do is we build the capacity of municipalities to do behavior change campaigns with citizens and businesses to do 3-stream segregated sortation. So organics, dry recyclables, and then everything else, refuse. And just by having separate streams, then all of a sudden the opportunities become massive because then you can have a separate collection of organic materials, and then you can process that in a way that has the lowest carbon emissions and also the highest potential benefit in other economic areas and job creation. So it could be compost that's used for regenerative agriculture. It could be anaerobic digestion that then is turning, providing fuel that feeds into the grid, and then you also have the compost that comes out of that. Carbon crediting potential is very untapped and massive to help support communities there and provide a return on investment for waste collectors who are separating organic waste, which they're not currently doing. And then there black soldier flies, another sort of like circular system where you can then use that for feed for agriculture, for fish farming. So tons of opportunities to develop new businesses out of organic waste, and it all starts with separating it as a separate stream, which isn't happening in a lot of places. But it's a very low-tech solution, and so for us, we're excited at like the potential for that. It's not some breakthrough technology that's needed. It's really just household behavior change and collection systems, and we feel like we can make a ton of progress on lowering emissions from organic waste by doing that.
Terrific. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. And John, over to you to.
I love that you guys brought up two of my favorite examples of really cool, bizarre, wild things that have been really fun dinner table conversations in my house, and it's black soldier flies and the artificial insemination database in Canada. My kids are older, don't worry. But it you get at that level, and it's really fun to geek out on this stuff, to think of what's possible with these kinds of advancements. And we're really just at the tip of this research that, so much effort has gone into figuring out every piece of equipment that you can make zero emitting in the oil and gas space. There's been huge amounts of attention and finance that have flown into this space. There has been a lot less attention for ag and waste. I've spent the last 23 years since the first study of methane and short-lived climate pollutants came out in the year 2000. Spent all of those years, most of those years, just trying to get methane to the point where people would actually pay attention to it. In Glasgow, we kind of finally hit that space where the world really started paying attention to it with the launch of the Global Methane Pledge. And then, the rapidly accelerating attention for methane suddenly brought attention to both ag and waste that didn't exist before. It led to, what you were talking about with this massive investment into understanding what the heck's going on inside of a cow so that we can figure out how to possibly reduce the methane emissions from cattle in better ways that go way beyond the small percentages that we can get right now. And the flow of funding and research into the waste sector. The waste sector has always been a little bit more complicated because don't deal with national governments. You deal with subnational governments, with communities, and it's not as easy for the United States or the European Union to just like throw $10 million out the door to a national government and say, oh yeah, we fixed this problem. It has to go to the city of Naucalpan in Mexico or Barranquilla. It has to flow to the spaces where the problem is. And so I think one of the big exciting things that we're seeing is the rapid growth of attention, the rapid growth of players in this space that are going and collaborating and working with communities in the waste sector to find out how they want to go about addressing their waste issue, not necessarily from a methane perspective, but at the end of the day, gets methane emission reductions. Because you don't walk into a community and say, hey, let's cut your methane emissions from your waste sector. Nobody's really interested in that. But they sure as heck would like to have clean streets and no smells coming out of the landfill or the dump or whatever. And so it's, I think, for me, the level of attention for this is the kind of thing that's really exciting to me. Yesterday we had the low methane launch, which is really exciting. I think, out of that, we still need to see a finance element that is developed that can really catalyze and get the money into the hands of the groups and the communities that need it to actually do these projects. And that has not been developed quite yet, although there is a commitment to move towards that. I think that's going to be a critical piece. We've seen developments in the oil and gas side of things where money is being developed and deployed for projects, but I think we need to see that definitely on the waste side of things. So I'm just thrilled that we're at this point. If you've been coming to COP for a while and chasing methane events, I know your feet are sore at this one because there are hundreds of methane events at this thing, and it's not a scientific measurement of what we're doing, but it is definitely a sign that methane is a key issue, and people are recognizing that. Last night, Inger Anderson said the methane is the lifeboat, and we have to take the lifeboat here because it's the only thing that's going to help us bend the curve on climate change. And it's not just about oil and gas. Oil and gas can only get us so far. We have to tackle waste. We have to tackle ag. In fact, if you look past 2030, the emission reductions that we need from methane, they all come from waste and ag. Between now and 2030, we can get a 70 to 80% reduction in oil and gas, and that's fantastic. We have to seek that. But going beyond that, the reductions will all come from these two sectors. I'll shut up now. Sorry.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll add a couple things that have me really excited. Within agriculture, we tend to talk a lot about enteric fermentation and livestock. But at New York Climate Week, I actually heard something that really caught my attention a great deal, and that's rice, which is the second largest source of methane in agriculture. And there's been a lot of research studies that show that you can reduce methane production by drying fields and changing irrigation techniques and these sorts of things. But Unilever, the large consumer products company that has a huge nutrition division, has actually started paying an incentive in their supply chain for farmers to do low methane production of rice. And in doing so, they're working to achieve their very aggressive net zero target at Unilever of achieving net zero by 2030. But those farmers who have adopted the approaches to production that Unilever is promoting are seeing an 82% reduction in methane in real life commercial scale production, not in research trials and things like that. So that's enormous if that is done at scale in commercial agriculture. The other thing that's really exciting to me is today, as we're having the first health ministerial at COP, people are talking about the health impacts of methane, and the impacts on respiratory disease and other things tend to be from the point sources and the areas where you get asthma and other things around methane flares. But looking at those negative consequences of methane also helps build that rationale for investment. Whether it's at the municipal or the national level or regulatory changes that reduce methane emissions in oil and gas. But taking us to another topic, we've seen some pretty big advances recently in methane monitoring, particularly satellite technologies and other things that allow us to see more dispersed sources of methane. So I wanted to ask a little bit about that. And here, or last year at COP27, and in the year since, what have you seen in terms of technologies and how those satellite technologies are evolving? John, I know that you guys are about to launch Methane Sat, which is eagerly anticipated. And what's the potential from subnational stakeholders to leverage those technologies and accelerate methane mitigation in both ag and waste?
Well,
the satellite, so I think
yeah.
you should go.
well, I was just on a panel yesterday actually with a company that is doing satellite imaging, and you probably know them, GHG Sat, and they're also working with SRON, and I'm really interested to hear what you're doing as well, because this is, I think, part of the reason that governments haven't been so focused on methane is because there's not very good data or accurate measurements. So you're being asked to reduce something that they don't really know how that like from what to what, you know. So I think if you demonstrate to national governments the baselining of like, here is your current methane emissions, and then by reducing it, then you can help to meet your NDCs and your targets. And I think there would be a lot more excitement about that, especially when you look at the ROI of reducing, you know, a ton of methane versus other ways that they could spend their budgets on climate mitigation. So I think that satellite technology is a great way to help benchmark that. We see that a lot with municipalities, as they really don't know where the methane emissions are coming from either. And so these satellite technologies, this GHG Sat 1 is high resolution in satellite terms, is I think a square kilometer or so, or no, I think it's 25 meters by 25 meters. That's about as high resolution as you can get now. But it does start to show the plumes of where methane is coming from. And then so now governments, I think, it would be really valuable for us also to prioritize what municipalities we work in when we're doing this segregated organics collection and market development, is like, let's focus on the ones that are the hot spots right now, because those have the biggest mitigation potential. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you're doing on that as well.
Yeah, and maybe I could talk a little bit about, there is an existing process that, you know, IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory, is a collective group, so that this is a UN-based program where we are, I've got that right, UN-based program where we are going to pull all of the data from various programs and various satellites and various sources to kind of create a uniform place where we can keep that methane data. And they've just recently announced, and in fact you can go and see in the UNEP pavilion, you can see some of the beta work that they've done with what the MARS, the Methane Alert Response System, which will start showing those plumes and say, okay, we know where the super emitters are. Let's pay attention to this and create a response to that. We're going at EDF, we're actually launching, as mentioned, early in 2024, we'll be launching Methane Sat. Methane Sat is a unique satellite. It fills a place that has not been filled yet by satellites. So right now, satellites can cover a lot of area every day with the way they look at pictures, or very, very tight, very small areas. Methane Sat will be in the middle there. So we'll have high resolution, but we'll also be able to cover 200 square kilometer sites at a clip. We're very excited about it. There's a lot of interest in it. It'll get down to that 1 square kilometer resolution is what we're going to report. Fred Krupp, our president, has made very clear we're making the data free for everyone. And so when we talk about subnational groups engaging with it or getting that data, they'll have access to that data to kind of help understand a little bit more about what those emissions look like. I think in the ag space, we're still trying to think about what's the most productive way that we can use this data. And what's really exciting to me is that we could also think about it to the point of MMRV and low-cost MMRV. How can we help farmers access climate finance, for example, in a low-cost way? So can Methane Sat help provide farmers that low-cost MMRV to help access climate financing? So really exciting. Again, it's going up. They don't tell me the exact date, but early 2024 is what I've been told. So stay tuned.
Yeah, it's like the first question that anybody asks Mark Brownstein is, when's it going up? The satellites are really exciting. But there's also a lot of other stuff too that's happening. There are companies that are doing aerial measurements and using planes and drones to map large swaths of the world and monitor methane emissions on a regular basis. Most of this is currently focused on the oil and gas sites, and they're monetizing it through working for oil and gas companies, because we've been successful in getting regulations that require emission reductions from oil and gas sites, and there's been a system to monetize that where you see the creation of these companies that are monitoring for methane emissions for the oil and gas companies. We don't have that kind of business model necessarily yet in the waste and ag space. But the need for data is huge. As Jeremy was saying, communities who want to address some methane emissions from their landfill have no idea how much is coming out of that. You can make rough calculations, but it's a really hard source to measure because of its diffuse nature. Same thing with some of the large agricultural operations. And so the satellites, the aerial measurements, they do hold the promise to bring that level of data that does begin to allow you to look at how you could possibly use credit systems like Jeremy was talking about earlier. There has to be a valid measurement to that to provide some validity to the credit that actually is going to be used then on the market. No one's going to buy the credit if there's no validity to it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space, and the satellites, I think, are going to be hugely, hugely helpful for both of these sectors because of they're so much harder to monitor. You can't really go out with an optical gas imaging camera to a feedlot or a landfill, and occasionally you see stuff, but it's not very common that you're going to be able to measure or visualize anything through the OGI camera. So it's really critical to have these technologies for getting these diffuse sources. I think the other aspect of this is we have to make sure that this data is both accessible to all, as you were talking about, but that there's also the capacity to receive the data. That communities, that we work with communities, that we work with national governments so that they have the capacity to receive the data and understand it and utilize the data. And this is a brand new space for everyone. Not every country has, satellite specialists running around that can pull raw data off of satellites or even understand the data that's coming through. So we have to build that capacity also, and at the community level, it's even more important. So.
Great, thanks a lot. So I was interested in turning a little bit to the private sector. We talk a lot about governments at the national level, the provincial level, municipal level, when we talk about ag and waste methane. But companies are discovering methane as an issue. As I mentioned, Unilever, Danone, who's a huge dairy producer, recently committed to reduce the methane emissions from their fresh milk production by 30% by 2030. Not insignificant. What are all of you seeing in the private sector in the reduction of methane? And maybe we'll start with you, John, since the ag sector is obviously very private.
Yeah, so again, thanks for bringing up the Danone commitment. So again, Danone in January committed to reduce their methane 30% by 2030. This was an amazing, I think let's put that in perspective. No other non-oil and gas company has ever committed to do that. And so really unique that Danone took the lead and stepped out there. EDF is their partner in helping them do that. So we announced it. It was a joint announcement between Fred Krupp and Anton, their CEO, in the Wall Street Journal in January. And they have just taken we're talking about livestock, taking the bull by the horns to help address methane and to find solutions to methane. They are actually also the first company to join the Global Methane Hub and Terek Accelerator. So really leading the way on that companies can take a role in this. I will put a teaser out there. So for anybody who's here on December 5th at 3:30 in the Women's Pavilion in the Green Zone, we are going to announce some additional dairy corporate action. And so I will put that teaser out there. I can't say too much more, but to just join us, because I think there's some really exciting action that's going to be happening over the next year on this space.
I would love to see more private sector action for the waste in particular, because, like, for us, well, I should say organic waste. For us, we have a lot of funding and partners in the corporate sector from plastic producers who are most concerned about recovering their packaging waste and increasing the supply of recycled content for the commitments that they've made. So all of the big brands, Danone, Unilever, P&G, Mars, et cetera, all very much care about. So how can you get us more supply of recycled plastics? But we're not hearing the same kind of action on organic waste from any of these food producers. I think it's part of it's an accountability is like you can't identify food waste by its source necessarily in the way that you can with plastic packaging, where it's clearly labeled as where it's coming from, and then organizations like Greenpeace or others will do like a plastic audit of who are the biggest offenders, and so there's an accountability aspect. And so I think for food waste that's ending up in landfill, there's not as much of that there. Although I am starting to see more companies, especially in like the coffee producing sector, that are more interested in compostable. This idea of like, what about compostable packaging, and what is the potential for the composting stream so that they can have as much of a circular market for the food and the resources that they're putting out there as possible. But most of the funding I've seen is like from CCAC, from Global Methane Hub, from like this other like philanthropy and multilateral sort of instruments that's going to food waste issues or organic waste issues. So I'd love to see more private sector action on that.
I think the place where I see the most interest from the private sector is really in the ag space right now. I'm sure you get these all the time too, John, but the number of cold calls and emails I get from investors who are exploring ways that they can invest in some new company or some new startup that is exploring a new feed additive or a new way to do this or a new way to do that is reducing methane in the ag space. It's really shocking to me actually how much the investment community is searching for those technologies. And so I think that's both driving I think it's driving a lot of development and a lot of interest in this space. It's also leading to some pretty crazy stuff that you're like, no, you don't want to invest in this. This is crazy talk. But I think it's really exciting that the like venture capital and others are getting interested in this space to help fund the kinds of startups that will produce eventually some really exciting possibility for reduction, especially in the ag space. And I agree with Jeremy. Like in the waste space, just by the nature of it, we don't tend. It's just not a space where as many private companies are running around that, and it doesn't draw as much attention. The companies that are in this space are not ones that people think of as very innovative, but there is some really cool stuff happening there. I think some of the space that we're starting to see more corporate interest in is in this space that actually bridges the two, both the food and ag sector and the waste sector. That food loss section. That kind of crosses over between the two. It leads to a tremendous amount of organic material that never makes it to the public, but nonetheless ends up creating a waste problem. And so we're starting to see a lot of corporate interest in reducing that part of the system that does cross over.
Maybe just to build on that, we had during Climate Week in New York City, we had a very interesting farmer, Chris Noble from Western New York. Chris grew up, I think he's 7th generation farmer from upstate New York. His family had put in a digester. They were early adopters of biogas digesters, and Chris came home to the farm and created a brand new business called Natural Upcycling, where he goes and collects food waste, secondary food waste, so from restaurants, from grocery stores, for example, that don't reach the consumer, and he moves those in, and they're across 7 states now, moves those into manure management systems. So into biogas digesters and co-digestion with manure, or into composting systems with manure. And so I think an example of this business opportunity that we see creating between merging the two.
Well, great. That's a good segue actually into my last question, which is the finance and economics of these innovations that we're looking at. And as we think about innovations and approaches in the ag and waste sector, what are the major things that we need to think about for that? I think you had mentioned, Jeremy, that really happens at the subnational level, not the national level, and that's a big consideration for the economics of it. But what are some of the things that are in front of mind for you?
Well, that's the drum I keep beating, and the biggest challenge for organic waste, that why there's no action happening, is because there's no financial system or financial incentives for municipalities to do this. So, okay, you want to do separate organic collection and treatment. Well, how is a municipality? First of all, they don't have the expertise to know what type of processing or what type of equipment they need in most cases, and then also who's going to pay for that separate facility where they're going to compost or whatever it might be, and then who are the buyers of that? What's the offtake market? And can they make that revenue neutral or even positive versus landfilling that material instead? And so we're trying to develop those business cases to take to municipalities to say, this is something, a project worth investing in, and then trying to attract some of those funders, whether it's their national government, whether it's a multilateral instrument or otherwise. But municipalities is like the easiest thing and most cost-effective thing right now is just to keep sending it to landfill. So the financial incentives aren't there. They're not incentivized to reduce emissions, usually from their national government. There's not some sort of like bonus cash transfer that happens because they lower emissions from waste sector. So there's all of this inertia continuing to divert all of these or send all these materials to landfill. Even though the solutions, as I said, are super easy. It's just separating organic waste at the source, at household or business level. But we need some kind of, I think a public-private partnership would be the best way to do this, is stimulated by some funding from private sector philanthropy in order to prove the model, prove the business case that then could attract scaling and funding that way. So that's the biggest barrier right now, and I think why most organic waste is still burned or sent to landfill or dumps.
And maybe I could jump in there before you go to ag. The money that does exist in this space is often very inaccessible to the communities that need it, because if there is a large multilateral development bank that has a fund for this, the rules around getting the money, the rules around getting the finance are very complicated. How you apply for this funding is not an easy thing. And if you're a small community or even a large community, you probably don't have the staff that have the understanding of like how you get access to World Bank funds or IDB funds. So that's a problem that we have to overcome also, in that there has to be a way for communities to access this stuff in a relatively easy way. I think the other piece of that is that now I'm losing my train of thought here on the other piece, but go ahead on ag. I'll remember it here in a second. My apologies.
Yeah.
I'm speaking on too many issues.
No,
They're all jumbled in my head now.
I think it's a great point about community and how we help communities supported. And I think when we think about agriculture methane, fundamentally it comes down to farmers having to implement solutions. And how do we help farmers implement those solutions? I'll talk about financing in a minute, but increasingly what we see is it's not just about financing for farmers. It's also about, do they have the infrastructure in place to support them, the knowledge infrastructure, the technical advice, the cooperative extension in the US, that the extension system to help support that change. I think on the financing perspective, what we're looking at is ultimately, can we really focus on those solutions that have a triple win? And that is, one, that we increase productivity to the farmer because there's profitability and improving the farmer's livelihood. Two, that we're increasing global nutrition and providing an enhanced global nutrition. And three, that also have those climate benefits. So that's our first round of how can we accelerate those practices that work. And maybe we need a little bit of catalytic funding to move those forward. That's an initial phase. But then ultimately we look at some of the existing mitigation practices, and they're just costly. They cost the farmers a lot of money, and there's not necessarily a return to them. So if we think about the existing feed additives that are on the marketplace, the farmer doesn't see a productivity benefit from that. And so we start to think about a blended finance model of, is there a carbon market play as part of that process? Also looking at how are governments going to step in. So we're talking a lot about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is going to be in negotiations this next year here in the United States. Sorry, we're not there. In the United States. But how do we use those models and public-private financing. So there was $20 billion in the IRA, for example, for conservation programs, farm conservation programs. How can we use those to help create an incentive and a pull to bring new market solutions forward?
John, have you got that last point?
Oh, no, it's going to come out when I speak in the next event.
Well, we'll just follow you around and we'll get it eventually.
I'll just carry this microphone with me.
There you go. Okay, great. Well, thanks for that to the panel. We wanted to throw it open to the audience if any of you have any questions of any of our panelists.
Can you say more what you mean by a methane to methane market?
Yeah.
I'm seeing there is unfortunately, I think the pressure is actually in a different direction, which I think is a bad direction. There are a lot of countries that are interested in throwing methane into the same basket as CO2, which would be horrible. We can't have methane and CO2 trading in the same space because it creates some extremely weird reactions within the system. You can incentivize, if you do that, you can drive incentives for methane reductions, but you could also drive incentives in the opposite direction depending on how things react. The last thing you want to do is have a single basket for methane and CO2 to be traded in. We've been advocating for a double basket trading system. The European Union was really interested in its last go round on negotiations around the greenhouse gas emission trading system. They were really interested in throwing methane into the same basket. We advocated very strongly to keep it out. As we go down the road with the increasing amount of data with satellites and all the other measurements, there is a point pretty far out into the future where you would have the quality and the ability to potentially trade them, but then you're still having at some point you still have to pick a GWP, and that even that creates a really big problem. So I agree with you. It would be great to have a market for methane. I do not want to see methane ever thrown into the single basket approach.
John, we'll take you a comment on that as well.
No, I think we're asking the same sort of questions and trying to think through this. And I think for folks who may not understand the science, so methane, again, short-lived climate pollutant. So in the first 20 years after it's emitted, about 84 times as potent as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so if you think about carbon as, there's a big win if you get a much better buy if you buy methane from a climate perspective in the first 20 years. And so, but how do you fit that into a market based on carbon is the big question.
I know less about the whole carbon crediting process and all of that. I have colleagues who are looking into that for organic waste mitigation, but I think for us it's more of a distribution of those funds that are more important, is that if the benefit can be brought to the communities or to the municipalities that are owning that, then that helps create like a a positive financial incentive in order to have separated organic waste and treatment. And so that's one of the, I think, financial benefits and the potential there, as long as that funding is flowing down to the communities where the action is happening.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Carlos.
Carlos Garcia with Astro Project. So a lot of the partners that we work with in methane mitigation, like Climate Trace, GHGSat, Actual HQ, they do everything from satellite to asset to portfolio monitoring and methane and emission kind of portfolio standards. One of the things that, and a lot of the funders that we work with as well, are asking us for non-extractive regenerative partnership models, a lot of them with energy asset owners, which are obviously very tough, but for food and ag waste and the kind of smaller scale general global south actors, they're are asking us really interesting questions about partnership and ownership models for a lot of these projects. We've got a massive amount of capital and investors and funds that are looking to deploy, but in a very specific way. So I'm wondering if, with your experience and ideas, partnership ownership models with some smaller scale food, ag waste ideas, interested in what you guys have seen have worked or ideas that you may think work.
Sure, I could speak to that in a couple of the places we work. So in Argentina, for example, a lot of municipalities will put out a bid to a cooperative to run their waste management system. So it's not a major company like Waste Management or GFI or one of these others. It's a cooperative that the history was they were informal waste workers, waste pickers originally, and kind of grouped together to create more of a cooperative structure where they all benefit from that system, and they run a lot of the waste management, waste collection, and so they're very incentivized by new financial models that are going to improve their cooperatives. So we have a great relationship working with them to try to come up with new offtake markets. So for example, we found buyers for flexible plastics that they were collecting but were going to landfill because they couldn't find buyers for them. So it's about matching them with those offtake markets. And currently they're dealing with organic waste but don't really have the dedicated processing or the offtake markets, so there's no incentive for them there. But they're very motivated by something that will help improve the financial sustainability and viability of the cooperative. So it's a great system to be working in because they're motivated to do that as long as we can find the right business case for them. Similar in Indonesia, where we work, also it's kind of disaggregated down to the community level. They're almost like social enterprises that are running the waste collection system. So again, they're run like little mini businesses, and so the more business opportunities you can bring to them, the more materials they'll collect and help divert. And so I think it's a great system to be working in terms of the distribution of the benefits. Again, it just comes back to the financing, is like, how do you get that system working? But I think it's a sustainable model because the people who are doing the on-the-ground work are invested in it and motivated to it.
And in a similar way, EDF is partnered with the National Dairy Development Board of India and their biogas subsidiary called Mrida. Mrida has a very interesting model, and they've started a very interesting examples of. So these are small-scale biogas digesters, backyard biogas digesters, 2-3 cows, and what the farmers use is that the gas from the cooking gas, they use it directly for their cooking gas, and so it replaces, for example, their cooking from biomass, so firewood, for example, or even dry dung. So really significant benefits for indoor air quality. So then kind of the next model up is that they've created a women-owned cooperative that goes out and collects the slurry, the digestate, and separates that out, and then takes the solids from that and creates a fertilizer market for urban gardeners, for example. And so that's a women-owned cooperative who then drive better incentives back to the farmers to purchase that slurry.
Yeah,
Sorry, for Jonathan. So is the idea like a tax equity flip structure when you're talking about incentives and tax? Yeah, sorry, both of you guys. Yeah, sorry. Just for that, in that structure you're talking about, is the idea like a tax equity flip structure similar to community solar projects with community groups?
For us, I think Well, I mean, the women they own the cooperative, right? So they have the equity in the business, and so they would get the dividends, for example, from any kind of profit from that process. Then, so the women own the business, and then they would pay farmers who are not necessarily all women, but they would pay the farmers directly for that product. So they have they're the equity owners basically in the business.
Yeah, and in Argentina, the cooperatives they sort of bid on the contracts from municipalities and then are paid through the municipality like that. But then they also own the materials effectively that they collect, and so if they can get more revenue selling those materials to an off-taker than sending them to the dump, then they're incentivized to do that. And so that's our big challenge: is how can we prove these new business models for circular materials rather than them just getting paid by the weighbridge, sending it to the dump or the landfill. And so they would be very happy to do that if we can say this: you'll get more money selling, compost than you will sending it to landfill. So that's what we're trying to do.
Great. Any last questions from the audience? Okay, well, as I mentioned, we're going to have a reception here. You're welcome to enjoy coffee if you're jet lagging like I am. If the caterer can find where we're located, there should be some food here shortly. And then in 1 hour, we're going to have a second methane panel on oil and gas. So take this time to network a little bit among methane colleagues, and we'll see you again in about an hour.